nature and lesbians, eating disorders and abusive relationships, the Troubles, and sex with a merman. Here's what I read in September. Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Sarah and I love to talk about books. And today I'm going to wrap up the books that I read in September. And I read 11 books in September, which I think is the most books that I've read in a month this year. But 3 were for the BookTube prize, so I won't be talking about those until next week when the results of the finals are released. And 2 were part of a trilogy, which I'm currently reading the 3rd book of just now, so I'm going to review them together in another video when I finish the trilogy. So I've got 6 very good books and they're all very different to share with you today. And just apologies in advance if I'm looking a bit sickly and sounding a bit croaky. I'm really hungover. I went out last night for the first time in, I can't even remember last time I had a night out, maybe July. So feeling a bit delicate, looking a bit rough, but I want to get this video up. So let's kick it off with Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. And I read Louise Kennedy's short story collection, The End of the World as a Cul-de-sac, last year. Absolutely loved it. Recommended it again recently in my video about recommending short story collections. And I was just really impressed with her ability to capture the setting of Ireland, particularly during the period of the Troubles, and her focus on women in difficult situations. So I was really excited to read this, which is her debut novel. It's set in Northern Ireland in the mid-70s, and the story focuses on Cushla. She's in her 20s. She's working as a teacher in a Catholic primary school, whilst also dealing with her mother, who is struggling with alcoholism whilst grieving the death of Kushla's father, and also helping her brother to run the family pub, which is frequented by Protestants and British soldiers. One of her young pupils, Davy, comes to her attention because he is bullied by pupils and teachers alike because he's the product of a mixed marriage between a Catholic, I think it's the father that's Catholic and the mother is a Protestant. And Kushla becomes entangled in both the difficulties of Davy's family and also with an older man who is a regular at the pub. And this is Michael. He's older, he's married, he's a Protestant and a prominent barrister who's known for objecting to the justice system, which is really prejudiced against Catholics. And in this peak time of the Troubles, Kushla finds herself in quite a precarious position as a Catholic in a mainly Protestant area, putting her head above the parapet for a family who are looked down on by both sides of the sectarian divide, and also having an affair with this married man who's much older than her and who is on the opposite side of that divide from her too. So as you can probably guess, this book is not an easy read. The Troubles were a horrific time for Ireland, for Britain in general, and this is made more harrowing by the inclusion at the start of each chapter of the children of Kushla's class sharing the news of like daily attacks, murders and disappearances. And I felt a really strong sense of this persistent smog of fear which must have hung over people at that time, and that's amplified by the situations that Kushla finds herself in. As a rule, I try to avoid stories of affairs told from the perspective of one of the culprits because it just cuts too close to home. But I think it's really testament to Kennedy's writing that she made me sympathetic towards Kushla, for the most part at least. The power dynamic and the things that are going on in Kushla's life make it more understandable, I suppose, that she finds herself in the position that she does. And so whilst her choices often made me really angry, I could see why she thought they were justified, or I think, which is more often the case, she felt she had to make them. And I read recently Anna Burns's Milkman, and so it was hard not to make comparisons between that book and this book. So set in similar times during the Troubles, and whilst Trespasses has a much more easier to follow narrative, there are definite similarities because both authors really build the atmosphere of the time whilst having these female protagonists who are completely themselves despite what's going on politically around them. But the books and the stories are very different, and they stand on their own strengths. So read together, they've actually given me a really great picture of that time, and I was really impressed with this book. Kennedy's definitely going on my list of authors that I will automatically read anything she publishes. Next up is That Green-Eyed Girl by Julie Owen Moylan. I always struggle with people with double-barreled names. This story is told over 2 timelines which pivot around the contents of a box. So in 1975, we meet 15-year-old Ava. She's contending with her mother's mental health breakdown and her father's affair with this younger woman. But then she's also worrying about typical teenage issues like the boy she fancies and the pool party that's coming up. A package arrives to her apartment, but it's not addressed to anyone in particular, and the contents send her on a mission to return them to their rightful owner. And then in the 1955 timeline, we meet Titchers. Is that not what bird watchers are called? No, they're twitchers, aren't they? We meet teachers, Gillian and I think it's Dovey, it might be Dovey, and they are having to conceal their long-term relationship from the world out of fear of repercussions of being discovered, losing their jobs, being sent to mental hospitals and things like that. And then the school secretary, who's this really unliked woman, but that Dovey mistakenly takes pity on, discovers their secret and then uses it to blackmail Dovey, and Gillian and Dovey's carefully constructed lives begin to fall apart. And I am a sucker for a dual timeline, and I think this book does it really well, with both of them leading up to the point where they cross over. It's also got some really fantastic characters in it, particularly Ava and blackmailer Judith. Ava, she's navigating some truly terrible situations, and so her emotions felt very authentic, but she also felt like just an authentic teenager too. And then Judith is just so perfectly evil. I also really liked the settings of both timelines, particularly that of Dovey and Gillian's story, because it really shows how difficult it was for lesbians to live with the prejudices of that time, being so in love with someone, so committed to someone, but being unable to share it with the world out of fear. And parts of this book really made me think of, one of my favourite stories, The History of Love by Nicole Krauss. Both those stories are set in New York, and they both have a young protagonist who's dealing with difficult kind of adult and family issues, whilst also somewhat naively trying to solve a mystery. I mean, the books are very different, but I clearly have a soft spot for young characters who are trying to navigate adult issues. And so I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a fantastic debut that makes me really excited about what Moylan's gonna do next. Then I read The Second Woman by Louise May, and this is about Sandrine, who is quite a lonely, reclusive woman. We learn that she had quite an abusive upbringing, and she is plagued by this crippling hatred of her body. And when she sees this distraught husband on television appealing for help after the disappearance of his wife, she's really drawn to him and compelled to join in a search for the woman. There she meets the man face to face, and as the wife is then presumed dead, their relationship develops. Sandrine is besotted, and she slips comfortably into life with the man who cried and his young son. But when his wife is found, it becomes apparent that things are not what they seem. And I thought this book was fascinating. It's tense and unputdownable. I think May is really a master of that conceal and reveal, with the truth of Sandrine's relationship being slowly exposed, whilst the truth of what happened to the first woman becomes clearer. And this book is not an easy read, but I think it's a really authentic portrayal of an abusive situation and the reluctance to admit the truth of it to yourself or to the outside world. I really enjoyed this book. It's a noir thriller that retains a literary sensibility. It kind of reminded me of Lullaby by Leila Slimani. I'm obviously really drawn to that kind of style of French noir. I thought it was perfectly paced. The characters feel very real, very relatable. I wasn't keen on the extent of body criticism that Sandrine levels at herself, but at the same time, I found it quite telling that rarely does anyone around her mirror the things that she thinks about herself. And so it does show how her lack of self esteem led her into the situation in which she finds herself. So, yeah, a gripping story that held me to the end. I'll definitely be looking out for more translations of Louise May's work in the future. I can see she's written quite a few books, but I'm not sure how many of them have actually been translated into English from the French. Next up, we have The Pisces by Melissa Broder. So, some things you need to know about me for context, particularly if you're new to this channel. I don't read smutty books very often, if at all. I'm not very interested in sex. I'm not a fantasy fan, and I really love my dog. So why the heck did I pick this book up? I don't know. Some things you need to know about this book for context. This book is a woman's existential crisis dotted with hookups for sex, very graphic sex with absolutely no soft focus, while also she's also attending therapy for love addiction, and some of that sex takes place with a fantasy creature, which requires a dog to be treated pretty badly. So again, why did I pick this book up? Why was I reading this? I don't know. But I did really like it, and I do know why that was. I also know that not everyone will feel the same about this book. So this book is about Lucy. She's split up with her cheating boyfriend. She's about to lose her funding for a dissertation that she's been writing for, I can't remember how long, but it's a very long time. And in her time of crisis, her sister offers her use of her apartment in Venice Beach for the whole summer, space to get her head down and work on this dissertation and time to attend therapy. And all Lucy has to do in return is look after her sister's very beloved dog. And Lucy does these things to begin with. But things quickly sink with a string of disappointing Tinder hookups, which send Lucy into a further spiral of neurotic self-examination. She meets a man who is swimming at night, and things develop between them. But it turns out he's not really a man, or not completely, and together they navigate the finer points of cross-species copulation. This book is a headfuck. Like, there's no two ways about it. But still, I approached the sex scenes with this squeamish sort of morbid curiosity, and found them to be entertaining breaks between Lucy's inner monologue. And I think it was that monologue that was the core of why I liked this book. She's a complicated character, but her overall inner workings were funny, they were insightful, and they felt really authentic. At times, she just made me feel so glad not to be her. But then at others, she jabbed me in the gut with her way of seeing herself. Her choices made me really angry, but I found her fascinating. Like a car crash that you can't look away from, like a single vehicle car crash with only the erratic driver involved that confirms that you were totally right in your own more careful driving decisions. In my case, the choice to just not have relationships, to instead focus on myself. I may not have shagged any sea creatures, but I sure have had my fair share of bottom feeders, and none of them would convince me to put my dog in danger. So that's what I'll say about that. Something very different next was a memoir, Women Like Us by Amanda Prowse. So I've read one Amanda Prowse novel before, I think it was last year. It was called Waiting to Begin, and I liked it well enough, but it isn't my usual sort of book. It's more of like that contemporary women's fiction. I really don't like that term, but you know the sort of book I mean. I could see she was a good storyteller, and so when I saw her memoir, which is a genre I'm much more into, and then it covered so many things that I'm personally interested in. I knew I had to pick it up. Prowse is a prolific writer. I didn't even know. She's written like more than 30 books in 11 years, that level of prolific. Writing had been something she always wanted to do. She was like storing away ideas for plots and characters in a filing department for most of her life. But she went through a whole other life before actually putting her ideas into being. So she grew up in this really tight-knit London family community, but her dad moved the family around multiple times to, build his career. And that kind of shook her foundations. She had an early failed marriage in her 20s, and then embarked on life as a single mother, which saw her, working all hours to support her son. Cope, Prowse turned to food as her comfort and her companion, and this is a dysfunctional relationship that follows her throughout her life, and the attendant body issues that come with that eating disorder. And I'm always interested in the experiences of women who are like the generation ahead of me, their thoughts on entering that stage of their life and their reflections on what's come before. And Prowse addresses a lot of issues that must be familiar with so many women around body image, the pressure to look a certain way, and that expectation that's on women's appearances, particularly as they age. And she looks at this from the perspective of someone whose weight is not deemed ideal. And I really appreciate that a lot because I'm very much that woman. I found her to be so honest and insightful about living with binge eating disorder. And that's something that I find so important because it's often like the hidden eating disorder. I don't know if I've talked about this before, but I've got issues with food, have done my whole life. Binging disorder with various levels of restriction or other damaging behaviors to go to go with it, has kind of been my life. And I do find that the medical establishment doesn't pay as much attention as they do to like the more immediately damaging disorders. Because I mean, from a personal anecdotal thing, I can't count the amounts and types of professionals I've brought my problems up to, and I've still never been offered any treatment specifically for that. It doesn't really get given I don't know, like the drama, the romanticism of other eating disorders, particularly anorexia. And I don't mean that as a dig to anyone who suffers other eating disorders. It's just seen less of a mental health issue and more about greed or lack of self-control, whereas something like anorexia can often be portrayed, especially in the media, as being almost awe-inspiring, at least until the sufferer becomes, ill and emaciated beyond the point that's acceptable to society. And I think a huge part of it comes down to fat phobia, because often, obviously, the outcome of prolonged binging behaviors is weight gain, which isn't seen to be as feminine. Sorry, Hamish is just joining us. It's not seen to be as like feminine or beautiful as like this waif fading away through sadness, even though most eating disorders do share similar etiology. And those of us who struggle with binge eating are then often left feeling isolated and with nowhere to turn, because our health has still been damaged, often just as much as it would be with other eating disorders, but it's slower and it's not as dramatic, so it doesn't really excite people who are in a position to actually help us in the way that other eating disorders might. Anyway, this is a booktube channel, but what I'm trying to say is that to see someone, particularly with someone with Prowse's profile and her fan base, being so open about it, it just really meant a lot to me. Prowse has a real warmth in her writing. She's funny and she's willing to share the unflattering or the very sad things in her life, and I can see why her books appeal to so many. As from like the one book of hers that I read previously, I can see that she brings that into her fiction as well. But much like with her fiction that I read, I did find that this memoir didn't go quite as deep or as literary as I would have liked it to go, but that's definitely a me issue, because she's just not that sort of writer. This is her life and her story, and she told it completely in her voice. Fans will love it. Women facing similar thoughts or issues that Prowse discussed will find it something they can connect with. I know I did. And it's refreshing to see someone in the public eye being so open and honest. Next, I read Abundance, Nature in Recovery by Karen Lloyd. And I picked this up because I felt my interest in nature and the impact of us fucking horrible humans on it growing. I mean, surely most of us have by now, given the very obvious impact of our collective bad choices. So the hopeful title of this book, that's what grabbed my attention. And in this, Lloyd recounts her various visits to areas in Europe and across the UK to projects where attempts are being made to restore the wildlife, restore the environment, including things like wolves and vipers. And I wasn't sure what her background was. I'm still not actually. I think she's just a writer, not just a writer, but she's a writer that simply has an interest in this field. But I felt that she was able to talk about the topic knowledgeably enough for someone like me who doesn't really know an awful lot. But I will say, like, I wasn't sure I was going to enjoy this to begin with. And I think I said this recently about another book as well. I think I'm more into the aesthetics of nature than the actual factual side, which is, I'm sure something is like, it's part of the problem that humans have and why we don't care for nature properly. And also, I just couldn't share the reverence that she had with vultures, which is quite near the start of the book. I also felt that there was kind of this element of things sounding a little bit overwritten, but I did grow more into the rhythm of her writing, and I did find further sections that were much more interesting to me on a personal level. And what I got from this book was really what I was looking for: hope. That there are people and organizations out there that are trying and doing things that are having a real impact. That things have been done where nature can, in fact, undo the damage, that balance can be restored, and that a better future is possible. Although I do get the sense from this book that those attempts are quite small scale, and it will take a hell of a lot more to make a true impact. I'm not sure if the world, being the way it is, would be capable of really taking steps that will make a big difference, but I cling to that hope. And this book has definitely inspired me to be more conscious, more switched on about the things I can control when it comes to my impact on wildlife. And it's definitely sparked a deeper interest, beyond the aesthetics for me. So I can see myself picking up books on this topic in the future. So those are 6 of the 11 books that I read in September, a nice wee mix. And all pretty good in their own way. I don't know if you've read any of these and what your thoughts on them were, or whether you would be interested in picking any of them up. I think most of them, except maybe the Pisces, I think most of them came out this year, or maybe like the end of last year. So they're all fairly new titles as well. This is me trying to clear my NetGalley backlog. And so yeah, a terrific reading month. I hope your September was full of good books too. Let me know what your favourite book you read in September was in the comments below. And I will see you next time with my reviews, reactions, rankings of the BookTube prize final. So until then, bye!